Good morning. Isn't it awesome to be in God's house this morning? I don't know about you, but I'm just excited to be here. And I'm really excited to get to share God's Word with you this morning. You know, it always amazes me to see God at work. And I know after knowing Him for all these years, it shouldn't amaze me, but it still does. You see, I was supposed to actually preach last week on the schedule, and then Jim George called and he said, hey, I've got a two-part message, so I'd like to preach back to back. Would you mind slipping back a week? And no problem. So I slid back a week, and for the last 2 weeks as I listened to Jim preach, and he talked about spiritual growth, and I realized that God had given me part 3 of his message. And you know, when you see God giving the same message to different people at different times, you know that it's God speaking to you. Because see, I didn't get this message in the last week or the last month. I got this message clear back in October without ever knowing what Jim was going to share. And the interesting thing was that there was a third party involved in this message that didn't even know that they were being God's servant when they talked to me. But after I preached last time, back in October, and after the service, Sandra Erickson came up to me. She gave me a hug and she gave me some encouragement. And I asked Sandra if I could use her name, and the first thing she said was, I'll kill you if you do. Because she knew I would tease her, but I'm not teasing her. Sandra, God used you. You didn't even know it, but you're the one that gave me the inspiration for the message. Because after the service, she gave me a hug and she said, Tom, you got my vote to be our next pastor. Now, I know you guys may lynch her for that or something after the service, but those are the words she said. It was a comfort, it was an encouragement to me. And then as I thought about what she'd said, it reminded me of a story of a young man I used to know, and he wanted to be a pastor more than anything else in the world. And so I want to share his story with you this morning. You see, the year was 1988. This young man was 33 years old, and he'd been a Christian over half his life. But he began to take stock of his life and question, what have I done to serve the Lord? You know, Jesus was about 33 years old when he went to the cross. And in his lifetime, he had rocked the world. And this young man thought about his life, and he thought, I haven't even made a ripple. So he went to his pastor, and he told his pastor his story about how he was feeling, about how he thought he needed to, get off of his chair and get up and serve God. So the pastor said, well, what do you think you could do for God? Well, this young man always wanted to be a teacher, and so he told him, he said, I've always wanted to be a teacher. Maybe I could do that for the Lord. And so he said, well, how about you start out by teaching a Sunday school? And so he started to teach a Sunday school class. He found out he was pretty good at it, and he really liked it. And so as God used him for that, he began to call him to do other things in the church. Pastor asked him, would you be willing to serve on a deacon board? The young man said, yeah, sure. And so he did that. And then the Awana leader came to him and said, hey, can you do some Awana devotions for us? And he said, yeah, I can do that. So he started doing Awana devotions, and he was fairly good at it, and he enjoyed that. And then they started to do children's sermons during the morning worship, and he started to do children's sermons and talk to the children. And pretty soon he was leading a youth group, and one day the pastor came to him and he said, how would you like to get up and preach? This young man said, I don't know about that, but, pastor said, I think you can do it. I think it'd be a good idea. So he got up and preached, and he found out he was reasonably good at that, and he liked it. And so he began to take stock of his life again, and he saw that, I'm serving the Lord, and I love it. I feel like I'm doing something for God. I really love this. I want to do this with my life. And so he went to his pastor and he says, I want to become a pastor. I want to go into the ministry full time, be a pastor. So he and his pastor hopped in the car and they drove down to the local seminary, and they went and talked to the dean of the seminary. The young man told the dean of the seminary his story. The dean said, "So you want to be a pastor? Well, you need to go to seminary." The young man said, "Well, that's where the little bit of a problem is. You see, I don't have a college degree. I've got a wife, I've got kids, I've got a mortgage, I've got a job. I have all these things holding me back." The dean said, "Don't worry about that." He said, "If it's God's will, He will work all those things out. But what you need to do is enroll in a correspondence course." He said, "You take a correspondence course, you get straight A's, you graduate, and then come back here and we'll let God work that all out." So he took the correspondence course. He got straight A's. He graduated. And he waited and waited for God to open the door for him to go to seminary, because he knew that's where God wanted him to be. And God never called him. And so he kept waiting. God didn't call. And he continued to wait. God still didn't call. In the meantime, he was still doing all these things at the church. He was teaching. He was preaching. He was serving on the deacon board. He was doing everything he could do, and God was not calling him to the ministry. And he couldn't figure out what was wrong with God. He began to feel like he'd been stood up for a prom date. Here he was, all dressed up, and no place to go, because God wouldn't take him. So he continued to wait on the Lord. And after a while, there were circumstances left his church without a pastor. And it was a small church, not a lot of people there with a lot of experiences at leading a church. And so he knew at this point in time he was going to have to stay exactly where he was for a while, because God really needed him there, and he knew that he would have to stay. Once it was all over and things were back to normal, then maybe God would call him again. But he needed to be there to help lead that church during some very difficult times. Well, he was there for more years than he expected to be, and after a while, as he grew spiritually, and God continued to not call him to the ministry, he began to realize why it was that God had not called him. You see, no matter how much he wanted to be a pastor, it was not God's choice for him to be the pastor. Took him a long time to figure this out, but he realized that there was a fundamental flaw in his faith. Now, I'm sure some of you figured this out in the beginning of this story. I said that this young man decided that he wanted to go into ministry. He wanted to be a pastor. And God knew, in his infinite wisdom, that if he granted this young man his wish, eventually he was going to find more pride in his position than he would have found joy in serving God. You see, God was giving him a little spelling lesson here. God was teaching him there's no I in servant, but there's one smack dab in the middle of pride.